All right, well, let me begin by saying good morning, and I'm not nervous at all. This is not intimidating in the slightest to be up here in the auditorium. I have taught Bible class before. I've taught adult Bible class before. So far, since being here at university, it's only been in that back classroom with, a nice small group of people. So this is a different experience for me. But we're starting our new quarter today. If you're visiting with us, so Aaron Schmidt and I will be going through the books of Joshua, the Judges, and Ruth over the next 3 months. And so this morning we're really going to, and Wednesday also, we're just going to set the stage and we're going to do a bit of introduction. So hopefully everybody can just kind of stand down, just take a deep breath, and we're not going to get way too deep into the word there for this first couple of days. What I do want to mention is we do have some really nice lesson books that Sharon printed off for us. They're in nice folders. So if you did not get one and you're going to be with us through this study, there are 6 or 7 maybe left in a box in the back, by the back door there behind Stan. So if you need one, feel free to go and grab one. I passed out as many as I could before class. And if you don't have one and need one, we have some more copies. They just need to be put into the folders. And so if you don't have one and need one, would you raise your hand so we'll know how many more or less, that we need? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 hands is what I saw, 14 in the back. So Sharon, we'll probably want 25 more by the time we're all done, but we have a few more that we can get for you this morning, and we'll work on it for the rest of them. If you have your book, if you have a lesson book, I'm going to display, it's going to be probably kind of small on the screen, but I'm going to show you what we're going to get into in the next 3 months. And so the first thing I want to do is just introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me or don't know me very well, my name is John Elliott, and I and my family have been worshiping here for almost 3 years. In fact, it was almost exactly 3 years ago that we came here for the first time when we were RV traveling across the country, and shortly thereafter my wife decided this was a place that we should throw out the anchor and should make our home. And so we moved here from Oregon almost 3 years ago. I am a registered nurse. I teach nursing at Florida College, and I also work for a hospital company based in Seattle. So I do a little bit of travel once in a while with that. But that's a little bit about who I am. I have 3 children. My wife, Leanne, who's, I think we strategically figured this out because both our wives are teaching Bible classes elsewhere. They're not in here together, and they're doing it together. So, whatever happens in here, they're not going to know about. So that's who I am, and I'll let Aaron introduce himself next Sunday. He can tell a little bit about himself. But that's who I am. So there's that. The structure for this study, how do you go through 3 books of the Old Testament in 3 months, and how do you do that justice? Well, we certainly are not going to get into a verse-by-verse, dissection of the word there. What we're going to do, though, and Aaron and I have been working on this probably since April. Did we meet the first time back in April? Because we knew that if we put it off, it was going to be kind of ugly. What we've done is split it up evenly. So we're going to look at each book for 1 month. So we're going to look first at the book of Joshua. And before I'm getting ahead of myself already. I already told you we're going to spend this week doing introduction. The remaining 12 weeks is going to be split evenly. I know that's really too small to see, but Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, the theme that we've picked for the whole study is just doing what's right. That kind of is a theme that comes out when you look at all of the 3 books. I think we can look at this thread of doing what's right. If we look just at the book of Joshua, we're going to look at the theme of success coming from following God. Success comes from following God. And so in those studies, we're going to break it down, and we'll look at the first 6 books next week, and we'll look at Rahab and Jericho. The week following will be Joshua 7 through 13, and that's going to be Ai and Canaan. And then Joshua 14 through 18 will be Caleb to Benjamin. And then the rest of the book, Joshua 19 through 24, will be Simeon to Joshua. And that will summarize that whole book. Then in January, we're going to move into the Judges. And the theme for the Judges is that sin is a reproach. And throughout each of our studies in the Judges, we're going to see this theme, sin is a reproach. So we're going to study Jerusalem's capture, Deborah and Barak, Judges 1 through 5. And we're going to look at from oppression to oppression, Judges 6 through 10. And then Judges 11 through 15 is going to take us from Jephthah to Samson burning the crops. And then from Judges 16 through 21, Samson weakens, up to mourning of Benjamin. And then in February, we're going to move into Ruth. Now, I think by the time we get through all of the Judges, we're going to be ready for something beautiful and something heartening. And so Ruth, the theme there is the beauty of a godly heart. And so we'll just take each week one chapter at a time, and we will look at the book of Ruth. So that's how this is going to break down. You have lesson books that have questions for each of the studies. And so if you flip through, if you haven't done already, there's one page, just 3 questions that I would encourage you to do before Wednesday's class. And that's really going to be just reflecting on these 3 themes. Success comes from following God, sin is a reproach, and godly hearts are beautiful. And I'd like for you to just spend some time, maybe after kind of reading through those 3 books really quickly, just kind of doing a quick survey, not reading really, really in-depth, but reading through it quickly just to refresh your minds a little bit, and then reflect on what do those things mean? What do they mean to you? I think it's important sometimes to think about what do we think we're going to talk about, and what do I think this means, so that as we go through and study it, then you can compare. Maybe some things came up that were surprising to you. Maybe some things were unexpected. So I think it would be nice to have that to go back and look at. So for Wednesday, I would just say, if you can do that review and spend some time thinking on those themes and just write reflectively about what you think those mean, and then we can discuss that on Wednesday. And then for next week, lesson 2, Rahab and Jericho. And you'll see for most of the lessons, there's going to be about 5 or 6 questions. Aaron and I really, really hope that that's going to be enough material to talk about for 2 class periods. And we will prepare some other things to study and some things to discuss. But we're going to have several chapters each week to look at. So there's plenty to work with. But you've got some questions to prepare, and I think that's pretty straightforward. So other than that, there's not a lot that I think is going to be especially surprising or different about the way that we do this study, but I wanted to at least explain how we plan this study. All right. So what we're going to do for some additional introduction is one of the things that I like to do when I'm going to study is I want to understand more than what I feel like I used to understand when I was a young kid in Bible classes. You know, Go back in your mind to the time of, flannel graph and, the little tiny chairs, sitting around the table. Because that is where many of us got our first sense of who these people were and what their lives were like. And I couldn't help it as I grew up and got older. A lot of my images kind of went back to, 5 years old in Bible class. Because once you have those images in your mind, that becomes your template. So one of the things that I try to do and enjoy doing is I want to get a sense of the real time and place, and a sense for these, I don't even want to call them characters, but these individuals as living, breathing, three-dimensional human beings like you and me. And so one of the things that I want for us to do is just to get a sense of the land and what it was like. It was populated over the centuries by different traveling and various tribal groups, people who moved in and out of the land over the years, depending on food and depending on politics and things that were going on at the time. It was not, when the Israelites moved into Canaan, they weren't fighting against people who'd been there for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. There had always been people coming in, groups moving around, fighting, killing, destroying, capturing, occupying, moving out. Someone else comes in and occupies. There really wasn't, it wasn't a group that had been there, since, shortly after creation and after the flood. It's also a land that had been constantly traveled from the north, from the east, from the south. The Levant, which is that section, we call it Palestine or the Levant or the near Middle East, where Canaan is located, had always been a crossroads. There had always been people coming up from Egypt to trade in Anatolia, Turkey, Asia Minor. There had been people coming from Mesopotamia. Even Abraham, which we'll touch on, had traveled up from Ur of the Chaldees, which was at the other end of the Fertile Crescent. And so this area was highly traveled, which brought a lot of churn. And as I mentioned, over the years and over the centuries, had been controlled by almost everyone at different points in time. All right, as I mentioned, Abram had visited there before. He had pitched his tent at Bethel when God called him out of Ur, remember? He had been there. He built an altar between Bethel and Ai, which are both places that are going to come up here quickly in our study of Joshua. Jacob had also been there. Bethel was where he had laid down and had his dream of the angels descending and ascending on the ladder. So here is a map, a fairly basic map, where you can see here where Abram started from. If you just imagine back before there was a whole lot going on, there was Ur. This traces Abram's route out of Ur down to Bethel, and he went down as far as Egypt and then turned around. So this gives you an idea. There's the Fertile Crescent, where most of the people of the age had lived and traveled from. And this is an older picture of some of the ruins there at Bethel. So you can get a sense of what the land looked like, perhaps. This one's a little bit more modern. So you can see a mountain in the distance there with a modern city, but you have this site of ruins there, supposedly at Bethel. This is probably a good time for me to make another disclaimer, is that the facts and the images and things that I'm going to present to you by no means are meant to be extremely authoritative. It's just to give you a sense. So we're going to look at a timeline that I had constructed for a previous class, and I expanded it for this one. The dates and figures, are very difficult to nail down exactly. So what I want to let you know is that I'm merely trying to give you a sense of when this is set, not exact dates. I'm not going to write a thesis based on this. This is not scholarly work per se. I was thinking maybe I'm a little bit more relaxed that Kenny Embry or Will Dilbeck aren't sitting in this audience, because they would be the ones who may really, really know. In just a moment, I have a video that I'm wanting to play that's going to explain more about the land and the people way better than I could. Again, this is not meant to be authoritative, but just something to help us get this situated in our mind. But this is an image from the video that I thought was very helpful. This is a cross-section of the land of Canaan. So if you were to stand somewhere down here at the southern end and look roughly northward, and you could see the cross-section of the landscape, this is about what it would look like. With the Mediterranean Sea being over here, you'd have this coastal plain, and then you have the hill country leading up to these peaks of about 2,800 feet, which by Oregon terms is not that high, but is very rugged. What makes this so unique then is in such a short distance, you have this massive topographical variation. So from sea level to these peaks of 2,800 feet down to the bottom of the Jordan Rift Valley, where the Jordan River is and where the Dead Sea is, at 1,350 feet below sea level, and then just immediately climbing back up even higher on the other side. When you think about the children of Israel marching around and coming to the River Jordan, do you think in your mind of them hiking down this canyon to the river? Because in my mind, I hadn't always really thought of it that way. I just kind of imagined, they're going through this dry, desolate place, and suddenly there's this stream, and that's the Jordan River. And that's not the way that it is. And many in this room I know have been there in person and have seen this, and so this will make a lot of sense to them, or you know this very well already. All right, so let's see what magic we can make happen here. That's just the link. I'm going to let Brian do his thing. Bear with us, and I really hope there's nothing surprising. There could be some commercials, but we're going to do our best.
Our planet Earth is a beautiful and complex collage of wildly varying terrain types, including, but not limited to, river valleys, forests, jungles, deserts, and mountains. These lands also contain a wide variety of resources. Our human ancestors made use of these resources to build civilization. Small settlements grew into villages, towns, and cities. City-states expanded into kingdoms and empires. As well as to build and create, humanity's energy and resources have been used to take and destroy. Since the beginning of written history, humans, which are often selfish and greedy, have used force to exploit the labor of another man's hands and take his stuff. The earliest war in history we have a record of took place between Elam and the Sumerian king of Kish, who boasted that he carried away the spoils and weapons of Elam. Undoubtedly, there were many wars before this that we do not have records of, and many, many more that have been fought since. Of all the pieces of land on earth, one of the most contested and fought over has been the Levant. Roughly speaking, the Levant is the land around the eastern Mediterranean coast. The southern portion of the Levant has commonly been called the land of Canaan. For thousands of years, a constant cavalcade of imperial armies have marched through and dominated this region. Canaan is not one of the most resource-rich regions on the planet, but it is one of the most strategically important, especially for many of history's most ambitious empire builders. Canaan was not only strategically important for the movement of armies, the region was also at the vital crossroads of all the major land routes for trade between Egypt and the greater Near East. Whoever controlled Canaan could regulate and tax the significant amount of trade that flowed through. However, controlling Canaan was never an easy task. For the relatively small size of its land area, there is an extreme topographical variation throughout the region. Different microclimates, terrain, and drastic changes in elevation naturally divide Canaan into many micro-regions. To oversimplify, most of Canaan can be divided into 4 broad categories. 1. The coastal plain. 2. The hill country. 3. The Jordan Rift River Valley. 4. The Transjordanian Plateau. If you looked at a cross-section of the land, it would look something like this. Because of science reasons, the vast majority of the region's significant rainfall falls to the west of the Jordan Rift, and the land within the rift receives very little rainfall. Consequently, much of the best farmland has been located on the coastal plain. Because the coastal plain and hill country were largely dependent on seasonal rainfall, they were susceptible to periodic drought and famine. To survive, this made it necessary for the people of Canaan to store away sufficient food and water for a rainy day. Or more accurately, many non-rainy days. If enough food and water was not stored, the only 2 options left for the ill-prepared were conflict or migration. The natural division the terrain encouraged was pronounced in bad times, and the every man, tribe, town, and city for itself mentality that developed then carried over to the good times. Although their languages, religion, and culture were all quite similar, more often than not, the Canaanites were very divided. The Canaanites were the indigenous inhabitants of the region, primarily descended from those that had lived in Canaan during prehistoric times. In addition to fighting among themselves, the alternative option, which was to leave, was also common in bad times. 2 of the early cradles of human civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt, were the primary destinations for Canaanite refugees. The flat open river valleys of these regions offered plenty of fresh water and food, but little in the way of natural defense. In contrast, the hill country of Canaan had significant defensive advantages.
Why is everyone spiraling over?
Defensive locations in the hill country that also had access to water from springs, rivers, streams, and rainwater collected in cisterns were often preferred as locations to build cities compared to other locations with better farmland and little or no natural defense. Cities like Lachish, Jerusalem, Samaria, and Hebron were all power centers chosen for their strategic location that made them difficult to besiege. In the north, the hill country and the coastal plain merge. The Canaanites of that heavily forested region became expert seafarers and merchants, and their high-quality wood was in high demand throughout the ancient Mediterranean. These Canaanites were later known as the Phoenicians. While the hill country of Canaan is not particularly unusual, the Jordan Rift is one of the most extreme topographic features on our planet. The shore of the Dead Sea is the lowest point of land on Earth, while the Dead Sea itself and the Sea of Galilee are the 2 lowest lakes in the world. The north and south of the rift are also drastically different from each other. The lower south is very dry, and the Dead Sea is 6 times more salty than the ocean, so its utility is pretty limited. In contrast, the north is wetter, and the water is fresh. There is marshland, ample wildlife, and farmland. For approximately 1,000 years, the city of Hazor was the leading city-state of the Northern Rift. The kings of Hazor were powerful enough to periodically command a coalition of northern Canaanite city-states. While there were many prosperous city-states in the Northern Rift, in the south, Jericho was the only notable city-state. This is largely due to the fact that Jericho has access to a significant amount of fresh water, a very rare commodity in the surrounding area. On the Transjordan Plateau, two civilizations, the Ammonites and the Moabites, developed. They both became centralized kingdoms in the later 2nd millennium BC. They were centered around modest river valleys, which were fed by underground springs that flowed into the Jordan River. The north of the Transjordan region was dominated by the Amorites and later the Arameans, both coming from around what is now the Syrian highlands. The economy of Ammon and Moab were largely dependent on the outermost inland trade route that connected the Near East to Egypt. That trade route passed through Edom. Like the other Canaanites, Ammonites, and Moabites, the Edomites were a Semitic-speaking people. They possessed some of the least hospitable land in the region. Because quality farmland was in short supply, the Edomites were predominantly semi-nomadic pastoralists. Consequently, whenever they could not make a living off of taxing trade, they often turned to banditry, raiding as far north as the Jezreel Valley, and to the west to the borders of Egypt. As early as the first dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs, the strategic importance of Canaan was realized. At the site which would later become Gaza, the Egyptians built a fortress which guarded Egypt's economic and military interests in the region. After a few hundred years, that site was retaken by the coastal Canaanites. During the early Bronze Age, several fortified Canaanite towns grew into cities. The largest known sites of this period were Enasur, Megiddo, and Jericho. The last centuries of the early Bronze Age were marked by the depopulation and abandonment of the larger urban sites in Canaan. Smaller farming villages and a semi-nomadic way of life became more prevalent for a time. In the Middle Bronze Age, urbanism returned and increased. It was during this period that Hazor rose to become the leading city-state in northern Canaan, while Ashdod and Ashkelon became the leading cities of the coastal plain, and Lachish, Jerusalem, and Hebron became the leading cities of the hill country. As the land prospered and the trade flowing through the region increased, imperial powers began to increase military pressure on Canaan. Senwosret III is the first known Egyptian pharaoh to campaign in Canaan. There he vassalized kings and extracted tribute and plunder. While Egypt put pressure on the south, the Amorite kingdom of Qatna put pressure on the north. They extracted tribute, and Hazor became a nominal vassal of Qatna. Perhaps because of this military pressure, many Canaanites migrated into the Nile Delta. The Egyptians called the wave of migrants, who were predominantly or entirely comprised of Canaanites, the Hyksos. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos overthrew the Egyptians and ruled as pharaohs in the Nile Delta for a century, before being defeated and driven out by the Egyptians. A somewhat traumatized Egypt became heavily militarized, and their number one policy goal was to control Canaan and prevent a Hyksos-like event from ever happening again. From the onset of the Egyptian New Kingdom, pharaohs repeatedly campaigned throughout the Levant. They brought the entire region under their control, making the Canaanite city-states their vassals. During the reign of Thutmose III, many city-states in the Levant rebelled, and at the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III defeated a formidable coalition of Canaanite kings. The Battle of Megiddo is the earliest battle in history we have a written account of. The date, tactics, casualties, and plunder were all recorded. Including his campaign at Megiddo, it took Thutmose III 14 nearly yearly campaigns to put down all the rebellions in the Levant. The city of Megiddo controlled the entry and exit point to and from the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley, which is shaped like an arrowhead, sits at the intersection of all the major land routes that connect the Canaanite coastal plain with the rest of the Near East. Consequently, the site has been the venue for many battles throughout history. Ancient kings, emperors, medieval crusaders, Arabs, and Mongols have all fought and fell on the Valley of Jezreel. Napoleon and Saladin won battles there. And as recent as 1918, more than 90,000 troops of the British and Ottoman empires clashed in the Jezreel Valley near Megiddo. The battle lasted 6 days and ended with a British victory. According to the biblical account, Israel's first king Saul was slain in battle at the edge of the Jezreel Valley while fighting the Philistines. According to the biblical book of Revelation, the last battle will be fought on the Jezreel Valley, near Megiddo. A transliteration of the word Megiddo is Armageddon. On a slightly lighter note than the end of the world, the ancient Egyptians also realized the strategic importance of the Jezreel Valley. So they built a fortress military and administrative center at the junction of the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan Rift. For well over 3.5 centuries, the Egyptians controlled Canaan, although there were numerous rebellions and the loss and regaining of territory. The Egyptians were successful at their top priority, which was to control and protect the Road of Horus, which allowed them to control military and economic movement in the region. To overgeneralize, things were pretty peaceful and prosperous for hundreds of years. Egypt engaged in diplomacy with other Near Eastern empires, and things were nice. Then, to cut a long story very short, in a short amount of time, empires collapsed, almost everyone died, people forgot how to read and write, and the whole Near East fell into a very, very, very dark age. This was called the Bronze Age collapse. If you want to know more about the Bronze Age collapse, I made some videos about it that you may be interested in. But back to Canaan. On the coastal plain, while things were falling apart, the Peliset, who were members of a band of baffling bad-time boat-bound brigands commonly referred to as the Sea Peoples, were resettled in Canaan after a failed amphibious assault on the Nile Delta. After a few decades, Egypt withdrew from Canaan. The Peliset, who were likely of Aegean origin, assimilated together with surviving Canaanites of the coastal plain, and they became the Philistines, who filled the power vacuum on the coastal plain, while Hebrew tribes filled the power vacuum in much of the interior. These tribes later formed into the Kingdom of Israel, which split into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Israel's new capital city of Samaria became the new power center in the north, and was the longtime rival of the Aramean kingdom of Damascus. The unconquered Canaanites on the northern coast recovered relatively quickly, and are more commonly known by their Greek name, the Phoenicians. They would go on to found the city of Carthage, which is famous for its wars with Rome and its brilliant general Hannibal. All of the states in the Levant were either conquered or vassalized by the Assyrian Empire. A long string of succeeding empires controlled the region. Over time, the common language of the region changed from Semitic dialects to Aramaic, and then Greek, and then Arabic. In a slow process, new people assimilated with the old. In today's modern population of the region, many are partial descendants of the ancient Canaanites. But exactly who is related to this ancient people, and to what?
Okay. Get back in here. Hopefully that was interesting. I don't know, it might have been, it's a little bit long. But I like that video just because it really fairly succinctly explains kind of the overarching history. All right, just trying to see if I can't get it to advance. Obviously, we have to take some of what's presented there with a big grain of salt because we understand some things happen a little differently. But when it talks about the Bronze Age, for instance, that's a time during which people like Abraham lived. That's not some, mysterious period that was many thousands of years before. There wasn't many thousands of years before. This is a look at the timeline that I had created, that I extended back, and I wasn't able to make it to scale. But using different resources that I had, just to get things situated in our minds, creation is dated back to about the year 4004 BC, give or take. So if this is about the year 4000 BC, Noah's flood in Genesis chapter 6 happened in about 2348 BC. Now, when I studied this the first time, when I was looking back, and I think it was for the Nehemiah and Ezra class, that had never occurred to me that there was 2,400 years encapsulated between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6. About 2,400 years of time. When you read those chapters, there's so much that we just don't have any record of. And why I can only guess is because the Lord didn't feel it was that important for us to know. We knew the important things, which was that mankind became evil. Mankind was evil. Sin was in the world. And so for about 2,400 years, mankind flourished on the earth before the Lord destroyed it in Noah's flood. Next time you read the book of Genesis, remember, you're looking at a huge span of time just in those first 6 chapters, of which we know very, very little. To me, that's fascinating. To me, that was totally changed the way that I look at the Bible. 2,400 years or so to Noah's flood, or rather, 1,600 years. Let's put it that way. This is supposed to represent only about 100 years. So between Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel. Noah's flood happened, all humanity was cleaned off the earth except for those 8 people in the ark. And within 100 years or so, we have the Tower of Babel. So things had gotten to such a point in that short of span of a time that we have the Tower of Babel. And then if we move a little bit further down, about the year 1921 BC, Abraham is called out of Ur. So that's only roughly 300 years after the Tower of Babel. And we looked at that map that showed the route that Abram took out of Ur. And then down here, so if this is 1921 BC, this is 1571 BC, which is about the time Moses was called. So everything that we're going to study is really going to happen further down here to the right after the wilderness wandering, which now we've got Israel in Egypt into the 1400s, give or take, and we're getting down to the years of the Judges. So we've got wilderness wandering going on here in the 1400s, and then this right here, if you can't see, is the year 1040, which is when David was born in Bethlehem. So just to try to put it in perspective, I'm going to scoot a little further down to the right. There's David. There's the end of the Judges period. Here is where David becomes king and reigns 40 years, writes the Psalms. And then here we have the beginning of the first temple in about 950. The first temple lasts about 360 years. And you've got 206 years of kings in the northern kingdom and 342 years of kings in Judah, the southern kingdom. And if we move further down, here's where the southern kingdom ends. Solomon's temple is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II. The site is desolate 50 years. We've got Habakkuk being written. We've got Zephaniah being written. We have Nahum being written. We have Joel being written. Micah is over here. And Ezekiel, Lamentations, Obadiah, Kings. This was a really, really busy period. But this is one of the things that also kind of blew my mind when I studied this before. Just to get these dates and peoples and places situated in my mind, I had no idea where that really fell in the real timeline. In the timeline that we live in, I think I had always thought that somehow there was a different timeline. It wasn't necessarily continuous with the timeline that we live in, but it is. Of course it is. And so realizing that all of these things that happen later in 1st and 2nd Kings, in Samuel, in the Chronicles, and so forth, and then in books like Ezra, Nehemiah, about 500 to 600 years before Jesus was born. That's all. 500 or 600 years. And if we go a little further down, the timeline kind of cuts off here about 330 BC. And I thought it was interesting when I studied for the last class. Here's Esther in 483. She's within 150 years or so of Alexander the Great. To me, that was interesting. Here's a couple of, these are more blown up just so you can see some detail, but I'm going to skip past this for now. We can always look at it again. If you're really interested in timelines, not everybody is. But just a few other things. So creation, we've got Noah's flood. The earth is about 1,600 years old. Methuselah died that year. And then Noah comes along about 350 years later, which I showed you. There we go. Okay. So I misspoke earlier. The first 6 chapters of Genesis is 1,600 years. The whole book of Genesis is about 2,400. And the rest of the Old Testament is only about 1,200 years. The descendants of Noah dispersed after the flood. And pay attention to Shem, because we may see him again. So after the flood, think about everything that had to occur after the flood. Think about what we think of as truly ancient in this world. The pyramids in Egypt, for example. That was after the flood. So it gives you a good sense of where that happened. All right, we will pick up on Wednesday and move through the history of the books, and then we'll get into our discussion questions.